It's Thursday, April 11th, and this is the 1909, the State News Weekly podcast featuring our reporters talking about the news. I'm your host, Alex Walters. This week, a new report gives us the most current, detailed look at the demographics of MSU. Students of color are increasing, but the university is still less diverse than it was 20 years ago. Then, we'll get a bit personal. A State News reporter shares his experiences with OCD. He says people don't understand it, which is creating an unconscious bias. Here to talk about both those things is the wonderful campus reporter, Jack Williams.
Thank you, Alex.
Welcome back to the show.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's been a minute since you've been on. You were on in the fall once.
Last semester for some of the Native American events and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But haven't been on since.
And look at you now. Well, anyway, so you wrote a couple stories this week. One, just a hard news story about this new report about MSU. And one, you talk about yourself. Talk about Jackie a little bit, which, is interesting. But anyway, before we get there, we got to talk about this DEI report. And you did a great job. This thing came out. It's this big, expansive report from MSU. You read it. You broke it down. You found some of the interesting data that people can be most into. Before we get into kind of your findings, the nuggets that you picked out, tell us, what is this DEI report? Who makes it? What does it say? How is it made? That kind of thing.
So the DEI report, it's sort of like an index of sort of diversity at MSU, and diversity that ranges from gender diversity, racial diversity, et cetera. So it's all these sort of things, and they just every year they'll come out with this little booklet essentially, and it's just kind of like maybe how populations have been changing, and that's sort of near the end about like those demographics and how they've been changing over the past year or so, or maybe 10 years. And then a big portion of it is also just sort of like events and other kind of things that they've been sort of doing throughout the year.
I see. And it's something that's prepared by the university about the university.
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah. So give us, before we get into some of the specific findings, overall, this is once a year that we really get this data, an overall kind of breakdown of the racial demographics at MSU. Give us that. What is the breakdown this year?
So this year, it's interesting. So they, when you get to the end and they have sort of all these like percentages and numbers of like different racial groups to be, specific, they have sort of a 1 year count of like how the populations have changed over the last year since their last, DEI report. And for this year, you see that most of the populations have increased. The African American / Black populations increased by 7%. And I don't think in that 1 year margin there was any real populations that went down. And this is in terms of student enrollment, undergraduate student enrollment.
I see. It's just undergrads.
Yeah, that's what we're talking about now. But they also, so what they also include is sort of this 10-year gap from like 2013 to 2023, because that's sort of what we're looking at here. And what we saw is sort of like a similar trend. A lot of the groups were sort of going up. And that's sort of barring a few sort of outliers. But so I sort of looked at that and I was like, okay, what if we look at sort of this 20-year gap,
I see. So 20 years ago, go back to 2003.
Yeah, because, 10 years, that can tell you something. But, I think these bigger sort of data ranges are also important. And so what I found was over the last 20 years, there were actually a lot of groups that had, it gets a little confusing, but they had gone up in the last 10 years. But if you compare it to that population 20 years ago, they had actually gone down, like overall. And namely, like, African American / Black students was one of those groups where in 2003, we had a certain number. I can get that number, but, that went down between 2003 and 2013. And now between 2013 and 2023, it's gone up again, but it still failed to sort of top that 2003 number.
I see. So you're saying MSU in this DEI report, they say, these racial groups, particularly Black students, are increasing. Look at the last 10 years, how much it's increased. But you went back and looked at 20 years ago, and even the increases amongst the last 10 years they're not as represented as they were 20 years ago with the 2003 data.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And another interesting, I think this is very worth mentioning, and I talked to Henry Mokita, who is the sort of comms director with the Office for Institutional Inequity, I believe. And he sort of talked about how in 2006, the state of Michigan banned affirmative action. And that was actually a big reason why you sort of saw that drop off, which, I think that's a very important piece of information to sort of mention, because I find there to be a lot of debate around whether or not sort of banning that actually, affects populations of people of color. And I think this is sort of evidence that it does,
Yeah, at least at MSU.
Oh, yeah, at MSU.
That's an interesting find, Jack.
And then furthermore, on the topic of sort of African-American black undergraduate population, they also make this claim that they are the #1 university in terms of that population, like in the state of Michigan. They have the most black students in the state of Michigan. And they provide data for that. And while that is true, they do have the most out of like all the Michigan public universities. It's not quite the highest in terms of percentage. Because, when you look at that kind of thing, I think it is right to sort of scale it to population. MSU is not as big as Wayne State, for example. MSU is not as big as Eastern Michigan.
It's a lot bigger.
Yeah, so we have a bigger,
I see. So MSU's data, where they're saying we serve the most black students of any university in Michigan, is just a number. It's not a percentage of the student body.
Yeah.
So they're comparing how many black students go to MSU with, tens of thousands of students to, a tiny school, Eastern Michigan or whatever with, far, far less.
Yeah. So if you do scale it and you just look at percentages, MSU actually ranks number 8th in that particular category, with Wayne State actually ranking number 2 and Eastern Michigan ranking number 1. And I find the Wayne State example very interesting because we have making sure I get the numbers right. I think we have, so it said we have, our total population in the undergraduate student population of black and African American students is 2,590. That's our number. And the Wayne State number is 2,528. So really not that big of a difference. However, if you look at the percentage, the Wayne State percentage is much higher. I don't have the exact number here, but Michigan State's is 6.6% of the total undergraduate population. Wayne State's, I think, is around like 13 or 15,
I see. But the conclusions they draw in this report are based on just the overall number.
Yeah.
Oh. And then what about another little tidbit? And your story goes through a bunch more data than we'll talk about today. But another little tidbit that I thought was really interesting was this little breakdown that you do of the gender breakdown amongst faculty and staff. Talk about that.
Yeah, so if we look at MSU faculty and staff, we see that 55%, it's 55% female and 44% male.
That's overall all faculty and staff.
Yes. However, if you look at the faculty members in the tenure system,
the kind of more prestigious tenure track faculty appointments.
Yeah, you find that it's actually 39% female and 60% male. So that was another finding that I found.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting. Well, Jack, you've done great reporting on this in a couple places, kind of seeing where MSU might be twisting the data in a way that's a little funny, and you're getting to the truth of it. We love to see it. Also truthful, but in a different way. You wrote about yourself this week, and we're going to talk about that. You wrote a wonderful column about OCD. Before we get into that, it opens up with this kind of great example where you're like guiding the reader. Can you do what you do for the reader of your column, for the wonderful listeners of the 1909, and guide us through this little thought experiment that you open with?
Of course I can.
Thanks, Jack.
So here's the thought experiment I do. And you can do this a number of different ways, but and I'll do it sort of differently from how I did it in the column because I think this way works a little better. But here's what I'm gonna have you do for listeners, watchers, Alex, etc. think of a panda. Just a regular black and white sort of. We all know what a panda looks like. Just envision one in your mind. Okay, now I'm going to tell you, Alex, in a second I'm going to tell you to stop thinking about a panda, okay? And when you think about a panda, I want you to raise your hand, okay? You ready? Don't think about a panda.
I feel like I did.
Okay, he raised his hand.
Because he said panda.
Yeah, exactly. So that's sort of the example we look at. Honestly, that example shouldn't tell you anything surprising. That's just telling you, hey, if I tell you something, you're going to think of it, no matter what. Just mentioning.
Even if you tell me not to think about it.
Exactly. Mentioning something, you're going to think about it. And that's not too crazy, I don't, or at least I don't think it is. But I think, what I do in the column really is I take a leap, I say, well, what if we switch that to something like murder,
Oh.
The thought of murder, it's a big leap, and
so instead of don't think about a panda, don't think about murdering someone.
Yeah, you might think about murdering someone. The images of that might come to your head, which they're unpleasant thoughts, But I think sort of with the panda, what we see is just because I got you to think of a panda doesn't mean you're like some panda enthusiast.
I'm not obsessed with.
You're not obsessed with panda, and I shouldn't I shouldn't make that assumption. It's unreasonable to make that assumption.
And to be clear, just now, you did say don't think about murdering someone, and I did think about murdering someone.
Exactly.
That doesn't mean I want to murder someone.
Yeah, and that's that sort of leap we make. It's just because you're thinking about something doesn't indicate a desire to do that. But what we also want to think about is, I'm telling you to think about it now. What if, say, you're just driving on the road and you thought about, like, hey, what if I hit that person, or what if I ran over someone on my way here?
Your own brain is telling you these things.
Brain is coming without anyone telling you. Does that indicate something about your character now? Because your own brain came up with it. And most people would say no, And because we have a word for this, it's intrusive thoughts. That's what we call them.
Yeah.
We call them intrusive thoughts. And, I think if you've been on the internet in the past, or if you've been on social media in the past, like
TikTok and whatnot.
Yeah, for the past year and a half, you should be familiar with that term. But what I've often found is that what people sort of say intrusive thoughts are don't really line up with sort of what I just told you. It's generally not like thinking about murdering someone or whatever else. It might be just like what I'll see on TikTok is like my intrusive thoughts won and I got a tattoo, or I slapped my friend on the head, because I felt like that. Those aren't generally the intrusive thoughts that we think of. However, that's sort of become, what I found is that's become like sort of the dominant definition of intrusive thoughts, if that makes sense.
So this is a very fun experiment. What does this have to do with OCD? Yeah,
so the connection to OCD is, and this is another thing that I often find to be misrepresented, is, I guess, let me ask you this. What do you think OCD is?
I think that, I don't know. I guess
I'm
you
cheating
did a little bit. I've read your column.
You've read my column, yeah.
Before I read your column, I don't know, what people talk about. They like the clean stuff, and light switches all got to be a certain way, or kind of that stereotypical OCD stuff.
Exactly, and that's sort of the dominant thing we see in the media. It's wanting things to be perfect or whatever else. Wanting to be clean all the time. And while those are symptoms of OCD, it doesn't represent all of them, and a lot of it sort of relates to these intrusive thoughts. And so if we break down the word OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, there's two parts of it: the obsessions and the compulsions. It's in the name. Mm-hmm. The obsessions is really what these intrusive thoughts are. It's what we think about. It's what I just talked about. You have these intrusive thoughts about something, and you sort of obsess over it. Because for the
I see the thoughts about the pandas or the murder. It's like
and it can be
thoughts that you can't get out of your head.
There's a myriad of things. What if I left the door unlocked? What if I'm a murderer? What if what if
they can be about yourself? What if I'm a murderer? What if I'm
What if I'm not clean enough right now, and I might infect someone with some kind of disease, and those are real things. And those are the thoughts, and those are the obsessions. And what these people with OCD have is they can't really bear the possibility that those things might be true. And if we really want to get into sort of how it works in the brain and all those scientific processes, so I spoke to, her name's Laura Lokers. I don't know. She founded the Anxiety and OCD Clinic of Ann Arbor, which is a place I sought therapy through when I was dealing with my own OCD.
Patient.
Not with her specifically, but others through the institution, yeah. And she sort of talked me through how this works in the brain, and I think she broke it down in a really nice way because when we look at the brain, right? Mm-hmm. Say you're leaving your house, and you lock your door and you leave, And then maybe you're driving later and you're like, did I lock my door? And you don't really remember. There's a part in your brain where it sort of seeks a certain threshold of certainty, if I'm 70% sure I locked the door, then I'm good. I can go about my day,
Like a neurotypical person, if you're just kind of mostly sure that you locked the door, you're good to go. You're not going to think about it anymore.
Yeah, you're good. And that's how most people's brain works. You know? The person with OCD, on the other hand, that threshold is more at 100, which, 100% certainty is not real, Another example she used, which I didn't include in the story, but I think is interesting. If you go to a DNA tester, and you say I want to know if this child is mine, and even if you know it is or whatever, they're not going to give you 100% ever.
Yeah, it's
going to be 99.9, whatever. They're never going to give you 100%, and that's exactly how we should think about our brains. We're never going to be able. You can never be 100% certain that you did anything, or you didn't do anything.
Yeah, but OCD makes you desire that complete certainty to be able to put it out of your mind.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people sort of it's understood, but it's sort of also poorly understood. So we don't fully know, but a lot of the theory is that there's chemical imbalances that kind of force you to sort of want 100% certainty. So that's the obsession part. And it's sort of ruminating on this, like, I need to be sure. It's about certain, I need to be sure that I did whatever, or I'm not the kind of person my brain is sort of forcing me to. The compulsions, on the other hand, that's sort of what you do to relieve yourself of that anxiety, of that stress, So, for example, like, we'll go with, like, locking the door, A compulsion might be going back to your house and checking to make sure the door is unlocked, or the door is locked, If you have this sort of fear that you're going to contaminate people, a compulsion might be washing your hands to make sure you're clean. Or in the case of the murderer, these ones, see, this is where it gets a bit more abstract.
Yeah.
If you think maybe you're like, what if I murdered someone? What if I'm going to murder someone? I'm not safe near people. I've seen people who, like, they can't really be near knives, because they think they might grab it and, hurt somebody with it.
I see.
They'll text their friends being like, hey, do you think I'm a bad person? Or they'll go on the internet and search, like, what are the traits of, like, a psychopath?
So the compulsion is sort of the way that you attempt to get to that 100% certainty, like ways you kind of soothe that desire? Yeah,
it's soothing the anxiety that comes with the those intrusive thoughts, those obsessions. And what happens is it relieves it, If you think your door is unlocked and you go to check if it's locked and it is, you're gonna be like, okay, I'm cool, I'm good, I'm grabbing the lock right now and it's locked. That's the closest to 100% you're gonna get, and it soothes it, but it soothes it very temporarily, So maybe later you're gonna have the exact same thought, and that's how this sort of cycle repeats. It's a very, like, debilitating cycle, and for a lot of people, it's very hard to get out of, very hard to live with, So sort of how people tend to circumvent that is in therapy, at least, they sort of help people, and I talked about this with lockers too, but I don't think I included it in the story, but it's sort of teaching people how to accept, like, the maybe, like, maybe I am this, maybe this happened, yada, yada, yada.
I see. And so this all seems so different than kind of the, like, in media and fiction, the kind of cultural definition that we've created of OCD. When people talk about, oh, I'm so OCD about this or that, you're a guy living with OCD. That misperception, that misunderstanding that so many people hold and exercise in their daily life, is that harmful? Does that have consequences?
What do you mean? Is it...
Well, I mean, just the fact that we're all walking around, at least until I read your column, I think until most people kind of hear about this, walking around completely misunderstanding this thing that affects so many people.
Yeah, no, 100%. I think, we talked about this too, about how sort of when you create these misconceptions, it creates how these people, or it affects how these people are treated, obviously. Yeah. And one thing that lockers had seen was sort of people who, they have these thoughts, maybe not, these, like, because like these thoughts, like, maybe I'm a murderer, or maybe like I'm, like, this bad person or whatever. And I know I'm really focusing on the murderer thing. I do want to make it clear that this is not, like, the definitive symptom of OCD. But
it's a good kind of like extreme example.
Yeah, it's so, like, there have been parents, they'll have this thought, and it's like, maybe I'm gonna hurt my child, and they present these to maybe the other mental health professionals, and mental health professionals who don't fully understand OCD are gonna be like, you can't live with your kid anymore. Like, these, I don't understand. Like, they don't understand the thoughts. So they're like, I'm going to contact a court. And she's seen people, like, who have their kids taken away from them because, like, a court and other mental health professionals deem that, like, you're not safe to sort of live in this house, And what I also do in the column is I tried to apply it to other mental disorders. While I can't fully relate to, because I have OCD, I don't have, like schizophrenia was one I mentioned. Yeah. But I do think we also create all these sort of misconceptions around just mental health disorders in general, or mental illness and mental disorders. Like, I don't know if you're familiar, but I often hear people use the term schizo to refer to people.
Like, as an adjective?
Yeah, as an adjective for being, like, paranoid, or even calling someone a psychopath. Like, psychopathy is, like, a real, that's in the DSM-5, So I think using those as adjectives, it sort of creates these, like, misconceptions, because I think I referred to schizo as, like, a negative adjective in the sense that, like, it's an insult, like, stop being schizo, you're being schizo right now. So it's like, what is your brain going to go to when you meet someone who's schizophrenic? You know, are you gonna view them as someone who's like, or are you gonna view them as like this other? Like probably, you know, because that's sort of how you use. That's sort of what you use that term in your language. You know,
sort of what we're doing. We're always throwing around these disorders as if they're adjectives about being so OCD about this or psycho about that.
Yeah, it's like, so, you know, when you meet someone who's like maybe opens up about their real intrusive thoughts, which, you know, are kind of ugly, you know, those are ugly thoughts. It's like, like, whoa, you know, like if your idea of an intrusive thought is like buying a shirt that's expensive, you know, it's like giving into my intrusive thoughts and like buying, like doing whatever.
Yeah.
When you meet someone who's like, I have intrusive thoughts about murder, you know, it's like, what are you going to think about that, you know, or because
So what can we do, you know, to the wonderful listeners who are still with us on the 1909 who want to be as affirming and supportive of friends who have OCD or other things? I mean, are there things people can do to be, you know, good, what, I don't know if you'd call it allyship or just support? Or
I think just sort of being aware. I don't think it's this thing that you can, we can, I don't, in this column, I don't call for people to like change society, you know, I'm not calling for this like completely, because I think to do that, we'd have to backpedal on like years of ableism that has existed in Western culture, you know, that would take, that would be, and I think that,
a little much for a state news column.
You know, and ableism exists within like these bigger institutions. So that's just like, I think out of the scope of this. What I think for just within your own social group, you know, I think you can just sort of be aware of like symptoms of, you know, mental illness and mental disorders, so that when people exhibit them, you're not, your immediate thought isn't like negativity, you know. I think as a society now, we sort of have this, we have this thing where we, you know, we tell people like, hey, reach out to friends if you're feeling depressed, or if like you have all this like anything else going on in your mind, or, you know, be aware. You know, we were always saying like, be aware. Yeah. But I think when it actually comes down to like some of these like ugly symptoms, we have no trouble just kind of like, you know, pushing these people off to like, you know, the fringes of society, you know, because it's like, we can say be aware, but I think actually being aware like of real actions that take place as a result of certain mental disorders and mental illness, that takes a whole nother level of understanding. So I think really understanding is sort of my point in all this.
And if you want to understand it further than you have from this podcast, you got to read Jack's column. It's a great read. Just like his story about the DEI report. That's all we have for this week. We will be back next week with fresh reporting from the great minds here at the State News. Until then, the stories we discussed and plenty more available at statenews.com. Thank you to Jack, my guest, for coming on and sharing all this, our podcast editor, Anthony Brinson, video producer, Brad LaPlante, and most of all, thank you for listening. For the 1909, I'm Alex Walters.